Welcome to my Christmas ghost story reading. 2020 has been a difficult year for many of us. Lots of us have faced quite devastating losses. Some of you might know me and my husband Rhett. We worked in the live theatre industry, which has been very hard hit, and we've both been out of work for 12 months now. So I was incredibly proud and grateful to be welcomed by Jasper and the team at Joffrey Books, who published my debut novel Under Violent Skies back in September. It was certainly the high point of the year for me. If you bought a copy, I'd like to say thank you. And there have been some wonderful reviews, and if you took the time to leave one, believe me, I am very grateful. You might like to know that the follow-up for Sarah Hurst and the Norfolk SCU team is with the editors for release in 2021. Now, for the last few weeks I've been working on a rather different project, a series of ghost stories based on the Norfolk folk tale of the Babes in the Wood and set in and around Wayland Woods and the village of Griston. So, in the tradition of M.R. James, I'd like to read you an extract from one of them as a Christmas ghost story. But before I do, I'd like to wish you all a very Merry Christmas and a happy, healthy and safe New Year. This story is set in 1649, at the end of the English Civil War. Roundhead cavalryman Henry is trying to make his way home to North Norfolk with his warhorse Oliver. They're caught in a rainstorm and seek refuge in a small alehouse in a hamlet run by Mary and her adult son Saul. Stranded in the weather, Henry and the horse are forced to stay for the night. The rabbit stew was tasty, the bread baked fresh that morning. Sweet wrinkled apples finished the meal. The storm raged on outside. The night sky was masked by rods of freezing sleet that hammered on the thatch and ground. Mary kept the fire well tended, and Henry made no objection when she and Saul sat with him in the tap room to eat their meal. In this new world, as ordained by Cromwell, all citizens were equal. Besides, it was surely the warmest room in the house. "I should check on Oliver," Henry said, as Mary cleared the pots to the kitchen. Saul found 2 sacks, draped one across his shoulders, and waited while Henry did the same, then led him out into the yard. The sleet had begun to settle, leaving icy shards that made the yard tricky to negotiate. Their breath left their mouths in sharply defined white billows. Henry tried to hurry, slid on the half-frozen mud, and was only saved from an ignominious fall by Saul catching him by the arm. The big man opened the stable door and led Henry in, lighting a safety lantern which gave off a low light. It was warm inside. The floor was deep in clean straw, fresh hay had been placed in the manger. Oliver had been rubbed down and a dry blanket strapped over his back for comfort. The horse must have been dozing when they approached and threw his head up in alarm until he recognised his master. As Henry patted his neck and fondled his head, the horse settled again, one ear flickering at Saul's soothing murmurs. "You like animals, Saul?" asked Henry. The big man nodded, looking enviously at the warhorse. "Wish I had a horse of mine own." "Too expensive?" Saul nodded. "Earlier on," Henry watched the big man closely, "when I spoke of the king, you said that you saw some children 5 nights ago. What did you mean by that?" Saul didn't reply at first, gazed at Oliver. Then he began to sing. The voice was barely a breath, but sweet and innocent like a child's. Oliver leant trustingly against Saul's hand until the man stopped. "Oh, that's lovely. Do you sing in church?" "Sometimes." "Is that a hymn?" Saul shrugged and pulled his lips closed. "What did your mother mean when she spoke of people being accused?" Panic flooded Saul's face. It turned whiter than the sleet outside. "Did Matthew Hopkins visit the village?" The big man stepped behind the horse and bent to run his hands down the animal's legs. Henry heard him whisper, "No, children, nothing." Oliver shifted in the straw and nuzzled Henry's hands. "We'd better let poor Oliver get his rest." With shaking fingers, Saul put out the lantern and drew the sack over his shoulders and head. Henry stepped out into the yard first. Saul followed, pausing to shut the stable door carefully. And in that briefest of moments while he waited for Saul to close the bolts, Henry glanced through the driving sleet towards the lane beyond the yard and to his horror saw 2 small children standing on the road by the corner of the alehouse. The boy was bigger, presumably older. The girl was gripping the boy's hands. They were poorly dressed for the weather, but paid no attention to the wind or sleet. Their cloaks were fastened at the neck and billowing around them, offering little protection. Henry was momentarily rigid, unable to focus clearly on the visitors as the sleet drove in painful gusts across the yard. He took a couple of steps towards them, sliding on the icebound floor. Saul caught hold of his arm again. "Look!" Henry turned to face him and pointed to the entrance. "There are 2 children out there. We should help them." Saul squinted through the storm where Henry pointed, then shook his head. "No one there, master," he said. "Come inside." "I saw them, 2 of them," Henry insisted, then took a few steps along the lane. The sleet was driven nearly horizontal by the force of the wind. It was difficult to see. "Isn't that them?" But the children had gone. He looked up and down, the sleet hammering into his face, his view limited to a few yards. He heard Saul come up behind him. "And if it is," Saul was shouting above the wind, "leave 'em well alone, sir." "Well, what does that mean? We can't leave 2 children out here alone in this weather." Henry spotted the pair moving along the lane out of the village and set off after them. "They be not real, sir," called Saul as Henry walked briskly away. "Only in your head. You won't catch 'em." "Nonsense! Superstition!" Henry shouted over his shoulder, hesitating as the 2 small figures seemed to have vanished again. "Bad things happen when they visit." Henry faced Saul as he came up to join him. "Are you saying this is witchcraft?" "No, sir." Saul stepped backwards in alarm. "No witches here, all God-fearing folk." "Then the children must be real. They must be there. They need help." Saul hung his head, unable to find an answer. In these uncertain times, men could be accused of witchcraft as easily as women. The memory of the witch-finder general was still fresh, and the fear he generated still potent. "Well, no witches here," said Saul. He crossed himself in the old way, backing away from Henry. "Come inside, sir." "For God's sake, help me find them." "No chillun, not here." Saul sounded frantic. He pulled his sack low over his eyes. Leave me be, nothing, I see nothing." And he turned and ran back to the yard as if the devil were after him. "Saul! Saul!" Henry shouted, his voice whipped away by the wind. And then he thought he heard an answering voice. "Saul? Saul?" The child's voice. Henry span round and looked along the lane. Beyond the 3rd cottage he caught a glimpse of 2 tiny figures climbing the bank. He set off at a run, repeatedly skidding on the ruined road, trying to catch the children. Reaching the cottage where he was sure they had turned off the path, he pulled himself up the bank and pushed through the hedge at the top. Its brambles dragged the sack from his shoulders, and he had to tug hard to release it. Fastening it round his neck with a knot, Henry set off across the field beyond, holding his hands above his eyes to try to see. Knowing they couldn't have gone far, he plunged on until he reached a belt of trees, where under the branches the storm was less fierce. Henry paused to catch his breath and surveyed the woods. Looking back, he could no longer see the lane, the cottages, or the alehouse. He must have come too far. Peering into the wood, he caught sight of the children. They'd gone some distance under the protection of the trees, and he didn't seem to be gaining on them at all. "Come back!" he called, but the woods deadened his words, and the children were still walking away. So setting off at a jog trot that he felt sure would enable him to overtake the tiny figures, Henry vanished into the woods on his rescue mission. Merry Christmas, everybody.